What's up, everybody, and welcome into episode 3 of Trial by Media, where today we are going to discuss a judge's role. What can they do? What can't they do? What should they do? What shall they do? Those are the kinds of questions we're going to be talking about today and answering, because a judge's role is incredibly important when the media attention is focused on a trial in their courtroom. We're going to talk about some judges that have handled it appropriately, some that have dropped the ball throughout the process, and even potentially some repercussions for how a judge even makes a misstep in front of the media. And to help me do that today, I'm bringing on my dad, George Tragos, and our associate, J.D. Patel, to walk through a judge's role here in the trial by media. So, JD, to start out, tell us where some of the rules and regulations come in judicial action. How does a judge learn and find out what they can and can't do?
Well, whenever they first get appointed or elected, they generally go to judge school. And that's kind of where they learn, their judicial codes of conduct, what they can't do, the standards that they're held to, kind of the basics of being a judge. So that's kind of the fundamental stuff of where you can look to pull that information from.
And Dad, how do they get held accountable generally?
Well, in Florida, they've got a JQC, the Judicial Qualifications Commission, where if someone files a complaint, it goes to the JQC. The JQC then has a hearing. It's actually like a trial to find out whether or not they should be disciplined or not. And then they make a recommendation to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then decides what discipline to do against the judge.
Okay. And when we specifically talk about cases with higher or more media attention, how does that generally affect how judges handle the case?
Well, I think judges are conscious of cases that have media attention. I think that they're more careful. They realize they're going to be more scrutinized. Everything they say is going to be recorded in multiple places. It's going to be criticized. It's going to be taken apart. So I think they're very conscious to be careful. At least they should be. Some judges, unfortunately, aren't too careful, and they should be. But judges generally are more careful when you have high publicity and you have a microscope on a trial.
And we've seen some cases where judges have had positive and negative scrutiny after a case that has a lot of media attention. JD, what are one of the things that we as the public or as lawyers should look out for with a judge when there's a lot of media attention on a case?
I mean, for conduct wise, I think we all need to be on our, let's call it best behavior, right? I mean, everybody needs to have appropriate decor in there. The judge needs to be able to control the courtroom and ensure that there's no outside, let's call it input in that sense. Influence, yeah. Right.
So you made a comment last podcast episode that we did about how sometimes judges can almost use it as a platform or a springboard to either get reelected, get reappointed, move up, whatever it may be. Are there any cases on that, or any situations where we can look at that as being true, as being problematic? Are there any rules against that? How does it work?
Well, they're going to end up doing it. And Stanford did a study about it, basically saying that those judges in criminal cases, they tend to, punish a lot more and give more severe punishments, because in criminal cases, the tendency is that the media is on the side of the prosecution, right? So all the citizens are in favor of that, and they end up trying to, they'll say certain things that the media may like to hear, that the public may like to hear, just to boost their chances of being reelected.
Dad, have you seen that happen in your career, where judges have used a high profile case or a big case and use it as a platform to then spring into something bigger and better?
Unfortunately, yes, I have. It goes both ways, actually. Sometimes what the judge does can ruin their career, and how they act and how they conduct themselves at this very public trial. Sometimes it can. It can they can go to higher office. They can run for election because their name has gotten out because of this trial. But we've seen, for instance, the Parkland case. Using that as an example, how what that judge was severely disciplined for how she conducted herself during that trial, how she got off the bench and she hugged the prosecutors. and she was so sympathetic to the prosecutors and so critical of the defense. So it can really hurt your career if you don't do it right.
So, well, let's talk about two situations here that have happened in cases we've covered on YouTube. First being, we'll start with the Parkland shooter, which is a negative reaction that happened to a judge because of the media. So she basically reprimands and was really hard on a couple of the public defenders, even the public defender and the deputy public defender, and the lead public defenders handling the case, and then hugging the prosecutors and the victims after the trial, all while the cameras were on. Dad, how do you think that would have been handled differently if there were no cameras and there was no media on that case, but she did the same exact things?
I think she might have gotten away with it.
I think there's no way they discipline her just from a
Right.
complaint from the public defender.
Right. I think she would have gotten away with it if it hadn't been all over the press and if it hadn't had that physical evidence of that video. Because again, I think, frankly, public defenders, lawyers, we complain about judges all the time. But when you've got something like that and the public sees it, I think it made a huge difference in how she was disciplined.
Yeah. And I think that as part of the process, having that transparency is something that people do want. We want to see impartiality with judges. We want to see impartiality with jurors. We want to see law enforcement doing the right thing and looking for justice and prosecutors looking for justice. But JD, kind of talk about the other end of it where, you just came from the state attorney's office. How many judges there did you work with? Are you friends with people running for judges or running for judge? So you can understand the relationship that these state attorneys may have had with the judge. So if there are no cameras in the courtroom, have you ever talked to a judge, high five or hug or discussion after a trial, things like that, where there are no cameras in the courtroom, but you knew them and had a personal relationship with them outside of court?
Absolutely. I mean, there are certain judges that we just become close with. I mean, the person that swore me in as soon as I passed the bar, still have a very friendly relationship. That doesn't mean that she's going to favor me more, but you have that working relationship and that friendly relationship with all of them. So I mean, it's going to be there. I mean, you work day in and day out with these people. There is going to be some level of friendship and working relationship between both sides, state and the defense, with that judge.
Right. And I think that's a big deal. And I've had cases on the prosecution side and the defense side where I've talked to judges for a long time after them, especially as a young prosecutor. Judges would sometimes take you back in chambers and tell you, I think you handled this witness well. You didn't handle that witness well. I like this better in closing arguments or these kind of arguments that you made. And that can be really helpful in making the process better and making lawyers better while not showing partiality towards one side or the other. And then again, even as a criminal defense attorney, tons of judges we have relationships with. We support lots of judges. I mean, we support just basically every judge. We want every judge to be fair and impartial, whether they come from the defense side or most of them come from the prosecution side. But that doesn't mean we expect partiality during a trial. And I think that's the problem is the hugs at the end of trial in conjunction with a lot of the other actions that were caught on camera and used as exhibits led the FACDL, Dad, the president of the FACDL, Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which is where that Parkland trial came, and you're a past president of that. He ends up writing a letter and she does end up getting disciplined. And I think he even references the media there and how the public got to see, and that's not how it should be. And it should make other lawyers not want to go before her, right? And the media had a big part in that.
Well, sure. And you got to remember, we've got two ways judges come to be on the bench. One is elected and one is appointed. She was elected. In Florida, these judges have to run for election, so they're popular. They have to get votes. So that's why you've got to be particularly sensitive to what they're doing because, you don't want them campaigning from the bench and, doing that type of thing. They have to go out and actually raise money. It's been commented on that a lot of lawyers contribute to judges' campaigns where they'll send them a check of money for their campaign. And yet this lawyer has to appear before that judge and that judge still has to be impartial.
Yeah. And I think that media highlights it, right? And that's the point of the podcast is to talk about how it's different with the media attention. And I, for one, think that case and that outcome definitely was affected by the media, not the outcome of the jury verdict, but the outcome of what happened to this judge and the fact that the cameras were still in the courtroom. And on the flip side, because I think the point JD was trying to make in the last podcast and even here today is we got to be careful that judges aren't like my dad just said, campaigning from the bench, which does not mean that you're not tough on crime, or you're not fair or hard or have rules, like that's all okay. And that's not necessarily campaigning from I almost said from the pulpit, campaigning from the bench, because you're just doing what's right. And if you're a good judge, you're more likely to be popular and get reelected. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about using certain things to maybe do things to the people that do support you or you're beholden to, that you campaign from the bench. And that's what judges shouldn't do. And again, as I transition to this next judge, that's not at all what I'm saying she did. But we're talking about a judge that was springboarded into a potentially higher profile than she ever expected, was Judge Doro in the Darrell Brooks case. Pro se defendant, very difficult. She was very patient, handled it with class and dignity, and she ends up getting a lot of support to run for the state Supreme Court. So she ended up doing that and losing, actually, but she got a lot more votes and a lot more popular and a lot more famous. People were dressing up like her for Halloween, and she was getting all sorts of praises because of how she acted from the bench. Do you see any problems with that, Dad? Do you see any problems with the judge doing a good job getting praise and then again using that to kind of take a career move, even if it didn't work out for her?
No, I think it's great because the public got to see her real life, how she would handle herself, and they got to make a judgment about that. I mean, how many times do we vote for politicians we never even see?
Especially
At
judges.
least the public had an opportunity to see, how does she act? How does she conduct herself? Is she the kind of person you want in that higher office?
I can't tell you how many people in JD, I don't know if this has happened to you yet, but it's going to. How many people that are your friends, they vote, whether they're the same party you are, a different party, independent, if you're independent, regardless, they know, this person stands for that or stands for that. But when it comes to judges, they have no clue who any of these judges are. And they're basically like, hey, which 3 judges should I vote for? Hey, do we want these judges to stay or do we want new judges? Let me know, because they're not associated with political parties. And when we talk about them, usually I try to give my honest opinion of who the best and most fair judges are. But at the end of the day, these judges probably have more of an effect on these voters' lives than most of the other people they're voting for on that ballot, because anything that comes through the courtroom that has to do with them or anybody they love, this judge is directly involved in. And when it comes to it, JD, talk about how the media in these cases can actually shed some light on who these judges are and people getting to know what should people look at when they watch these cases and see how judges act.
I mean, I think it's the best chance for the citizens to actually get to know who these judges are. I think that's one beneficial thing because, like you were saying, nobody generally knows who these judges are, right? I have attorney friends that come up to me and ask like, hey, who should I vote for?
Mm-hmm.
Even my fiance, she works at the 2nd District Court of Appeal, and I have no idea who these judges are. So whenever it came down to voting, I was like, hey, tell me about each one of these judges so I can actually get an insight as to where they stand. And, aside from them being publicized, and again, these are few and far between that we get to know about these certain judges that cover the high profile cases. But I think that the more and more that, we're able to see the public or see these trials be publicized, I think the more and more it's going to help the general society and citizens vote and make educated choices.
And transparency and accountability are really important in the judicial process. And we've talked about it with the lawyers already, with law enforcement, with state attorneys, with criminal defense attorneys. It's also there for judges. And I think that's an important part of the process. Now,
and actually, I'll mention one thing too, that about the Darrell Brooks, the judge in there. She was actually very transparent because she came forward and said that one of the fathers of the victims had made a contribution to her campaign, and that he was in the same building essentially when she was in private practice, and did some estate planning for them. Ultimately, it wasn't enough for her to recuse herself or be disqualified at that point too. So the transparency is there, and I love that about her.
Yeah, and I was going to ask that's kind of a good transition, Dad, into how judges get recused. So we can talk about the recusal process, but specifically how the media can highlight that. So something like this comes up, and I bet that lawyer also donated to a lot of judges' campaigns that are in the county, right? It's not unusual for lawyers to support lots of judges and have relationships and work with lots of judges, especially if you're a lawyer like my dad, who's well seasoned and has had interactions with most of the judges in the Tri-County area, right? So, I mean, that's not going to be abnormal for somebody to be like, oh, I used to work for George Tragos, or I used to work with JD Patel now, or Peter Tragos. As we grow older and our age group of lawyers start becoming judges, we've worked with a lot of them. So, Dad, talk just quickly about the recusal process. We've kind of already talked about it, but how can the media being part of the case or having a lot of media attention highlight when issues like that come up that came up with Judge Doro in the Brooks case?
Well, frankly, a lot of times the media digs up the conflict. You'll see it in the paper. The media will go back and look at all the campaign contributions of that judge. The media go back and look at all the prior rulings of that judge. They will actually dig up the stuff that the lawyer may use to try to get the recusal, because these are things the lawyer may never find out if the media didn't find out. Plus, the working relationships. Did somebody work for somebody? If I can tell a quick story, I had a trial down in Fort Myers before a federal judge. They're not elected, they're appointed. The federal judge used to be an assistant U.S. attorney that I supervised when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The judge said, look, I want to tell you guys that Mr. Tragos used to be my supervisor. But then he would say, but if I recuse myself, I want to let you know that the other judge you'll go to that's down the hall, Mr. Tragos used to be her supervisor too. So there was no place to go. He never recused himself because he didn't feel that me being a supervisor made that big a difference.
And we lost anyways, right? I mean,
unless
I tell that story a lot.
I know. And so it's a situation where recusals are only situations where you have actual concrete conflicts, not something that just is tangential, that really doesn't mean anything. But again, the appearance of impropriety is something else that judge has to be conscious of.
Especially with media attention, right? It's like a magnifying glass on all of this. And speaking of that, there was a case in particular, Kyle Rittenhouse's case, where Judge Schroeder, I think that's how you say it, or Schrader, who is an older judge, a seasoned judge who used to cite himself and his own cases throughout the trial and decisions that he had made, which is always one of my favorite things that judges do. It's a big league move. But he would specifically comment on what the media was saying about him, about the lawyers, about some rulings, and how that's outside noise that shouldn't come in. But I remember when covering the trial, a lot of people in the chat and a lot of the public were like, why is he allowed to look at it? Why is he allowed to read it? What are some of the no-nos and things that are okay for judges to do as far as media consumption goes?
Well, consumption, they can consume everything they want. They can read anything they want because, let's face it, he's going to make rulings that evidence can't come in. Well, obviously, to make the ruling that a piece of evidence can't come in, he saw the evidence. So we trust judges to be able to overlook the things that can't come in or can't be used in a trial. Now, judges commenting about some things, that's a different story. The case you're talking about, that Rittenhouse case, that judge went on a rant about the media. He sat there and blasted the media for what he thought was commenting on his rulings and making comments that were not proper comments or not comments according to the law.
Or false.
But then again, those comments were made in the media. The media has constitutional rights to be wrong. I don't know. Again, I don't agree with that judge making that comment, because all he was saying was, you guys can't say things that disagree with me. That's judges getting into the media and getting into the debate, and they really shouldn't do that. They should stay above the debate. And
so you think that was enough to have to recuse himself?
Right.
You think so?
No, I think that no, because what he was commenting on was not on the defendant's guilt or innocence. He was commenting on what the media did.
You just say that looks bad.
Partial toward the defendant, but not toward the media.
Okay, so I'm asking specifically. So you just think that looks bad, basically?
Yes, I think it looks bad. I absolutely do think it looks bad.
Okay. What do you think, JD, about kind of the lines of what judges can and can't do when it comes to consuming the media and commenting on it?
I mean, you should definitely be a lot more conscious of what you're doing. I mean, especially in these kinds of cases. I know that in Rittenhouse, there was a point where he was basically forcing everybody to, applaud for a witness that was a veteran. I mean, he was definitely defense favorable in that case. And he had made it very abundantly. He had made it very clear, because he would patronize and attack the prosecutors, throughout. And that's kind of what some of the things that he was getting, attacked on by the media was that reason.
So I think that's your perspective of the trial, that he was defense favored. But I mean, I think there were times where he felt like maybe it was going either way, which again, maybe just shows maybe some level of impartiality. There's also some pretty legitimate and obvious error by the prosecutor in that case. doing and saying certain things that he should not have done and said in a trial that were misstatements and mischaracterization. So I think the judge ended up potentially getting frustrated with that throughout the trial as well. He definitely did some unorthodox things, telling jokes, talking about the Packers, talking about the weather. And again, talking about the media was another one of those things. Now, he's probably the type of judge, like federal judges, who feels like he's pretty safe in his seat. And I think that's something that's very different with whether you have a younger judge who's less experienced versus an older judge with more experience, or of course a federal judge appointed for life. I don't know if they're appointed there. I don't really know how it works in Wisconsin, but
He's actually the longest sitting judge right now
period.
in Wisconsin. Period in Wisconsin. Yep.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, exactly. So I mean, he doesn't have a lot of fear of getting booted, would be my guess. But again, I do think that judges consuming the media, I don't have a problem with. They're not sequestered like witnesses. They're not sequestered like jurors. Neither are lawyers. Lawyers are allowed to look at what the media is saying as well about a case, and they can bring a problem to the judge if they need to fix that problem. And the judge has discretion, in my opinion, to be the gatekeeper to fix that problem. And the next thing I want to talk about is what exactly can judges do when they feel the media has become a problem? And Dad, you kind of mentioned you don't think speaking publicly to the media in open court is something that they should do. I think that's fine. I think an admonishment to the media is fine in open court and within the discretion of the judge to do. Probably not during trial, which is when this happened, but definitely in the pretrial phase. Do you see a difference between the pretrial phase when things are going on versus the actual trial when this happened?
Well, it all depends on if what's happening in the media is something that could affect the trial. I think that's the key. Could it affect jury selection? Could it affect what the witnesses say and do? Could it affect the lawyers? Are the lawyers giving these interviews that could affect the trial? So that's what the judge has to do, protect the integrity of the trial, not necessarily be the policeman of the First Amendment, a policeman of press. He's not a press policeman, but he has to protect the integrity of the trial. And that's when he can intervene if he thinks something is happening that's going to affect his trial.
So I do think that there's at least an argument that even during the trial, the media could affect pressure on witnesses or jurors to do a certain thing or come out a certain way, which is similar to the problem in the pretrial phase. So I think potentially that could be within the discretion, even if the way that he did it was a little overboard. And I can understand why people take issue with that. And there were some things that he did that were very wacky kind of throughout the trial. So when we talk about what they can do, right? So we know in the Kohberger case, a lot of media attention, gag order, Lori Vallow, Daybell trial, cameras ended up getting booted from the courtroom. In what trial was it? The YNW Melly trial here in Florida that we just had. They sequestered the jury for the actual deliberations. So those are three things judges can do, right? Gag orders, sequestering the jury, and removing cameras from the courtroom. Do you feel like any of those things are too much or too little based on the amount of media attention? Do you think they should be more prevalent or less prevalent than they are right now with these high profile trials? And JD, you go first.
I mean, I think that what they're able to do is perfect. I mean, you have to be able to ensure a fair trial, right? And all of these outbursts that may happen, the ability for that to happen, a lot of money goes into setting all of this up. And you don't want to redo it for an outside force like the media, right? I'm all for the media being having a lot of knowledge about the case, giving them access to it. But if it's going to affect the proceedings and make everybody redo it again, it's not worth it. I think the gag orders are a perfect thing to do. I mean, is it effective? I mean, to the best they can, right? Somebody's going to end up leaking something ultimately. But I think what's in place is good for now. I mean,
what do you think, Dad, about the application of it, right? So we don't see it a ton, especially like a jury sequestration. We can kind of take one at a time. So let's talk about jury sequestration, right? That protects the jury from media reporting during the trial. That protects them from hopefully the pressure they may feel to come out on one side or the other. That protects them for when the media or some YouTuber comments on a witness and how a witness was and whether or not they seemed credible and which lawyers are doing better, right? That protects them from that. How often do you think that should happen? More often, less often, or do you think it's about right with how judges allow that? Because lawyers ask for it a lot. Judges have to make the decision as to whether or not it rises to that level.
I think it's about right. And the way you can tell that is there are very few reversals based on
Exactly.
jurors being tainted by the press. So if it happened a lot, if God's juror said, you know what, I voted this way because the reporter was sitting on my house all day and I wanted to get rid of him, that doesn't happen. So because of that, I think the proof's in the pudding in that we have a situation where it rarely happens. It's rarely used, which is what it should be, rarely used. And that we can see that there's rarely a reversal based on that information or based on
Yeah, and I think that that's a good way to look at it, like in the appellate courts. But I do think that there is more opportunity for that to be the case now that jurors are giving interviews with the media and on YouTube channels and whatever it may be. So I think we might get a lot of times that doesn't happen and we don't know about that because jurors never say what happens back there and they don't have to. It's protected. They can if they want, at least in most jurisdictions, but they don't have to. So a lot of times we don't even ever get that information. So number two, what about gag orders? Do you think they're used enough, not enough, or just right?
I personally have a problem with gag orders. That I do have a problem with, and that I think that they can be overused because we've got First Amendment issues. We've got a lot of people saying a lot of things, and who do you give a gag order to? The lawyers and the defendants. They're the ones that can't talk. Yet the whole world can get out there and slam everybody and slam all the evidence, and you can't say anything because you're the only ones the judge gives a gag order to. I do have some problems with gag orders. To be honest with you, I think they're overbroad sometimes, that they protect too much information. And the ones I've seen that I really don't like are the ones that give the prosecution the discretion to label what is or is not confidential or sensitive. And therefore, the prosecutor can say, oh, that's sensitive, so that means you can't say anything about it. Those are the gag orders that really give me a problem.
So one thing in conjunction with gag orders, and JD, I want to hear what you think, whether or not you think they're used too much or not enough, is I think, and I'm not like Mr. Sanction heavy or, wanting lawyers to get sanctioned or anything like that. But I think if judges more appropriately sanctioned lawyers who spouted off in the media and said things that are unethical or just embellishing or clearly not true, if there was more legitimate sanctioning by judges to that conduct and behavior, I think it would be less likely that we would need so many gag orders. Because if it's legitimate information, if it's things on the public record and they're talking about that, or they're saying, just wait, there's more evidence than there actually is, or they're saying, well, we'll see what law enforcement says about this, or they waited 6 months to even do this testing, that type of stuff is legitimate and I think gives context to the case. But when you start saying stuff like all law enforcement is lying and they're planting evidence on my client and all this stuff, and that's just not true, well, then sanction them for that, because I do think that's inappropriate and goes against a lot of bar ethics rules. What do you think, JD, about gag orders?
Well, I'll come back to that in a second, but in the Casey Anthony case, at a point in one of the pretrial hearings, the judge threatened to fine both the prosecutor and the defense $100 every single time they would speak to each other, because they were on such fighting terms that they couldn't get through anything. So, the judge,
I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's not how we're supposed to act. I don't really care what any lawyer does in a courtroom. That is not how we're supposed to act. And I think the judge should control the courtroom like that. And that's a really good example of another high profile case.
As for gag orders, I mean, I think I'm on the side with George where it needs to be limited in that sense. I think that the fact that the prosecution can get, discretion on what they deem confidential and stuff like that is pretty
That's
big.
unusual, I think, at least in the ones I should say that
Right.
I've seen in the high profile cases today's day and age.
But I mean, I don't have a problem with them being used. I think it has to be done. You want to protect the fairness of the trial and not leak too many things and keep everything under wrap.
Okay, and the last one that I think we mentioned, and then JD, you can think of any other things a judge can do, is removing cameras and or microphones, or limiting it, or releasing it the next day during a trial, during open hearings to the public. What do you think about that, Dad, as far as a judge's tool in dealing with the trial by media? Do you think it's done too much, not enough, or about right?
That one probably is a not enough, if you want.
You think they should limit it more?
I think they should limit it more as a sanction. Now, again, I think they should have open courtrooms. I think you should have cameras in the courtrooms. But when they do something that you think is improper, the judge thinks that, they film a juror, or they focus in on a face, or they don't really give a fair representation of what's going on in the courtroom. I think as a sanction, it's certainly appropriate for the judge to use that as a sanction to control his courtroom and to keep the media fair that comes out of his courtroom.
But just to make sure we make sure we're on the same page, is like, what is something that deserves a response of a sanction? That does not mean just a lot of media attention. A lot of media attention, a lot of eyeballs, a lot of clicks, whatever it means. That is not something that the appropriate response is removing cameras or microphones, right?
Well, there's one a case you've covered a lot where the media was actually listening to attorney-client conversations that was going on in the courtroom. They shouldn't be doing that, and they shouldn't be reporting that. So that's something they deserve a sanction for.
I agree with you. That's what I'm saying. There has to be some kind of abuse of the privilege, either, zooming in on a defendant's face and commenting on what makeup she's wearing that day. High sensitivity mics where you're picking up attorney-client privilege. That is all sanctionable. Putting cameras where you were already ordered by the court not to put them there. That is sanctionable. But what I'm saying is, in these cases, when they first come down and they're immediately high profile and there's a lot of reporting on them and a lot of eyes on them, that alone does not mean we have to limit cameras in the courtroom, right? You would still think, put the cameras in, put the mics in, and as long as everybody abides by the rules, we're good.
Well, again, not so that they're intrusive into the process. In other words, one camera, rather, you don't have 10 cameras in the courtroom. Yes, with proper controls, every trial should be open. Every trial should be publicized. Every trial should have the ability to have cameras if the press wants to cover it.
And I think most judges think and feel that way too, which is why I so often comment on the fact that this is why we can't have nice things. We can have all the cameras. You can have all the microphones. You can give your opinion as to, there's a lot of evidence against the defendant, or they have this witness, or the law enforcement did a bad job investigating. Like, you can make all those comments. You can write those stories. And I don't think there's going to be sanctions of pulling cameras and stuff. But when you start to turn it into the Coliseum and entertainment and try to get the crazy headlines based on the footage that you got, that's when we start, after we've been given an inch, we try to take a mile as the media and people who talk about these cases. And that's why, I was trying to nail down, like, just because there's media attention, just because it's a high profile case, just because it's a celebrity, doesn't mean, okay, we got to back all this stuff down because people have interest. It's what they do with the leeway that they're given in putting cameras and microphones in the courtroom. JD, did you find anything else? If not, what are your thoughts on how cameras and microphones are used?
What I was going to say was, I see the future where it's going to head is to stop these issues that are obviously happening so often now. Is I think the courts are probably going to install a camera themselves, and they're going to have, one source. If you want to pull from there, by all means, but we're not going to let 5 different cameras come in the courtroom, and let them zoom in. If you want to pull the footage, here it is. If you want to use it your way, this is how you're going to use it. But I think that's the best way to curtail all of these things that's going to end up happening.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And then you're only connected to the microphones of the person that's talking. You're not installing any additional mics. They can, like my dad said, hopefully they don't, but some bird's eye view camera where you can't even really see anything, but it is open to the public and, you can see the courtroom. It's kind of like at the state attorney's office, they have that CCTV where we could watch other trials. You could kind of tell who the people were, but it was grainy and green kind of, and, you can hear them, but it's not perfect. But I think that that's at least potentially checking the box and not making it like a Hollywood TV scene. Now, I think that they'll get better cameras and put them in more spots so that you can actually see the trial that's going on and see the witnesses and things like that without seeing the jury. But I do think that's a good point, and that could be kind of where we are going. Another thing, okay, and I don't like politics, but in today's day and age, a lot of judges are appointed. And even in states like Florida, there come time to time where the governor appoints judges. And Dad, you can kind of explain how that process happens if you want, where there is a political side to this. Even though they're supposed to not be affiliated with any political party, Donald Trump now, okay? And I don't really want to specifically talk about any of his cases, but he has a lot of cases going on in front of judges that could have connections to either him appointing them or people that he appointing them, or somebody from the other side appointing a judge, and how it's just not going to be fair. How do we deal with politicizing judges, knowing that some of them are appointed and that stuff is easily accessible and people can find it out anytime they want? If there's a high profile case with a political angle, which so many of them have, How do we deal with that with all the media attention that that's going to get?
Well, first of all, you just can't help it. There is always an article. Every judge that has a high profile case, there is an article just on the judge and just talking about the judge. And they'll go through how many children they have, and they'll go through, their family and their parents and their net worth and all of that. And in what may happen with the on the Trump cases is you have federal judges and state judges, which is going to be interesting to watch. Federal judges on some of his cases appointed for life, state judges elected, and they have party affiliations as state judges. I was on the Judicial Qualifications Commission where we would recommend judges to the governor. And although in Florida we have nonpartisan judges, everybody knows what party a particular judge comes from. And when they go get interviewed by the governor for his selection, he knows what party they're registered Democrats or registered Republicans. So all of the politics always comes into play. You can't help it. And everything, your whole life is under a microscope if you're a judge in one of these high profile trials.
And I'll actually comment on something too. Sorry.
Yeah.
So in Florida, there was some big news recently, within the last year or so, where they created an entire new district court of appeal. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of the judges, they either move some over to that area and start appointing some. And there's a lot of conflict cases now. What's going to end up happening is the Supreme Court, who actually just, I think 2 or 3 got appointed by Governor DeSantis. A lot of these cases are going to be in conflict, and then they're going to get certified up to the Supreme Court. And basically, all these judges that he was able to put in to the court are going to start favoring his conservative side. So there's always a political motive behind everything.
Well, yeah, and I think that I don't know that there is, but there's definitely one the media can point to, right? And it's going to be a story if it can be, and we have to expect that. Now, circling it back to, and I don't want to harp on the Parkland judge. I think she's probably a really good lawyer. She was probably a good judge. Emotions were high. She probably felt horrible for the victims. I can understand. We represent victims every single day. I can understand those feelings. I think the point is, and the reason why, even though I feel for her as a person, I think she's probably a great lawyer and a great person, I don't know her personally, is this is the difference with judges. When you're appointed, when you're elected, whatever it may be, you have to remain impartial. And even the appearance of impropriety or impartiality can be so much bigger of a problem with you than it could be with a criminal defense lawyer or a prosecutor or a victim's advocate or whatever it may be, a civil plaintiff's lawyer, civil defense lawyer. The judge has to remain in that middle ground, or else everything can get called into question. Because we just talked about, we did an entire episode now about what they have discretion to do. Get rid of cameras, get rid of microphones, close the courts, gag orders, witnesses with masks on, what evidence comes in, what evidence doesn't come in. And so if they're impartial and they're connected to a political party and they're letting it be known, and that's why the cameras are being blocked, now our judicial system becomes a major, major problem. So Dad, why don't you just talk about, kind of to finish off the podcast, we'll go Dad and then we'll go JD. Just what judges should do, if you had any advice for judges, or what you hope to see going forward, and how judges handle trials with a lot of media attention or cases with a lot of media attention.
I think the number one rule would be keep your mouth shut. Don't comment on it. Don't talk about it, and totally ignore it like it's not there, because it doesn't impact the trial. It's not evidence. It's not something you have to comment on or rule on. So unless it affects your trial, keep your mouth shut, leave it alone. Don't comment on it. And that would be the number one rule.
And real quick, before you go to number 2 rule, not even to your friends. Like, not even to your friends. I mean, we've seen law enforcement and fire departments showing disgusting pictures of Kobe Bryant's plane crash and how that exploded. It's like, do not, judges, law enforcement, whoever, don't even talk to your friends about it, because if it's a high enough profile case, somebody will probably sell you out to give some leak that the judge said this about the case. So I love that. What else?
Number 2, be conscious of the optics. Don't let the appearance of impropriety slip in either. Make sure you're above reproach, even in the way you look. Even if you're doing nothing wrong, don't let anybody be able to interpret what you're doing. And I know that's hard, but you've got to try to anticipate. Is what I'm doing have the right optics?
All right, JD, what do you think to add to that?
Just think twice before you say anything. That's what we do is we use our words, and as a judge, those are, that's what you live by. Be conscious of what you say, because they can come back to bite you. They can ruin your career. They can make your career, they can ruin it just as quick. So I think that's the biggest thing.
And I would just add, remember the public, right? Least restrictive means necessary to protect the right of a fair trial for the defendant, for the prosecution, for everybody involved. But public access is really important, and it keeps accountability and transparency throughout the process. So I think that's really important as well. All right. So interesting conversation, right? About judges that their careers went up and down because of the media attention, how it affects cases, how it changes it. I appreciate you guys joining me. That's all we got. Until next time. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok at Tragos Law is our handle. And don't forget to listen to the Lawyer You Know podcast featuring new episodes every week. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, The Lawyer You Know.